Hi, my name's Andrew Farris. I'm an attorney here at Merritt, Webb in Durham, North Carolina. My major practice area is criminal law, and in that context, I get a lot of questions about firearms. One of the most frequent questions is about traveling with firearms. That has two kind of components. The first is concealed carry reciprocity, which I'm going to talk about first, and the second is just traveling with firearms in general. Reciprocity means that one state recognizes another state's license. In North Carolina, a valid handgun carry permit issued by any other state is recognized in North Carolina. Now, there used to be a lot of complicated rules about the standards that other states had to meet in order to be recognized in North Carolina, but the General Assembly recently did away with that. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that it is valid out-of-state permits. A lot of states have a residency requirement such that if you move permanently to North Carolina, your out-of-state permit is no longer valid. And that varies between states, so you need to know your own state's law if you can't plan to carry in North Carolina under an out-of-state permit. The other big thing to keep in mind is that while carrying in North Carolina, an out-of-state permit holder is subject to North Carolina firearms laws, specifically the laws governing where someone can and cannot carry a firearm in general or a concealed firearm. In that regard, your best resource is this pamphlet produced by the North Carolina Attorney General, updated on a yearly basis. It here in the back has a lovely list of concealed carry do's and don'ts, and that will help keep you out of trouble, and it's very easy to read. The other half of reciprocity is whether or not a North Carolina permit is recognized in another state. And that gets complicated. Different states have different standards on what they require before a permit is recognized. Now, the North Carolina Department of Justice is supposed to keep a yearly updated list of states that recognize North Carolina permits. Unfortunately, that list has not been updated for at least 2 years, since September 2012, so you're going to need to look at some other resources to try and suss out whether or not a North Carolina permit is allowed in another state or recognized in another state. The best resource would be either that state's Attorney General's office or that state's chief law enforcement organization, so the equivalent of the SBI in another state. The SLED in South Carolina would be an example, or the TBI in Tennessee would be another example. In some states, it's the Highway Patrol. And what I would do is Google the state name, handgun reciprocity, and then scroll down your results list and start looking for .gov or .us websites. A third very helpful resource is the NRA page, specifically the NRA Legal Defense Fund page, and they have reciprocity maps and rules on carrying in each state, and you can find that by just adding NRA to the end of that search I just said. So state name, reciprocity, handgun, NRA, and that should take you right there. Do check the update date on the NRA web pages. Each state's web page on the NRA website has an update date. It's more than a year or two out of date. You want to be concerned. And maybe just go ahead and call the AG or whatever the chief law enforcement agency is. I know that's a lot of hoops to jump through, but not something you want to do by the seat of your pants. The second thing I'm going to talk about is interstate travel, but without concealed carry permit reciprocity. There's a federal law, the Firearm Owners Protection Act, 18 U.S.C. 926A, and that law says that as long as you can legally possess a firearm in the state that you're leaving from, and you can legally possess a firearm in the state that you're going to, you're not subject to state firearms laws in all the states you pass through to get there. So say if I'm here in North Carolina, I'm going to Maine, I can legally possess the firearm here in North Carolina, I can legally possess it in Maine. It doesn't matter what the rules are in all the states that I'm driving through. Now, the Firearm Owners Protection Act usually comes up in the context of travel by car, but it applies to all forms of interstate travel, but if you're not transporting yourself, whoever is transporting can have their own rules, and they can either prohibit it or add a bunch of rules that we'll talk about in a second. Now, to be protected under the Act, the firearm and the ammunition have to be stored separately, and they must not be readily accessible. In the case of a vehicle without a compartment that's separate from the passenger compartment, i.e. a car that does not have a trunk, like a truck or an SUV, the firearm and ammunition must be stored separately in a locked container other than the glove box or the console. So locked in a trunk box, in the bed box in a pickup truck, or something of that nature. The second requirement for being protected under the Act is that you remain in interstate travel. If you are no longer in interstate travel, you are subject to whatever state laws are in that state. For instance, if you stop overnight, it is clear that you are no longer in interstate travel. Unfortunately, you can be no longer in interstate travel even if your stop is inadvertent. There is a case, for example, where someone was found to be out of interstate travel and illegally possessing a gun under state law because he'd missed his connecting flight and had to take a hotel room. There is a sort of a gray area. It's clear that staying overnight is no longer interstate travel. Case law in other areas suggests very strongly that stopping for a burger or stopping for gas is interstate travel. It's in between those two that is kind of gray. If you're going to be stopping to go for a short hike or to visit a historic site or to have lunch with friends, then out of the abundance of caution, you should probably go ahead and look into that state's firearms laws. Another caveat to this is this applies to everyone, so you can always comply with the federal law and be safe, but if you do have a North Carolina concealed handgun permit or any other state's concealed handgun permit and you're traveling through a state with reciprocity, you may have different rules that you can apply to, but you can always be safe if you're complying with the federal standard. Firearm and ammunition separately, locked container, not accessible. Air travel. All modes of transportation are included in the Firearm Owners Protection Act, but if you're traveling in somebody else's care, they may have their own special regulations too, and that's certainly the case with air travel. TSA has a number of extra rules that you may be familiar with if you've ever gone on a hunting trip or something like that. Unloaded firearms in a locked hard-sided container must be checked baggage, can't be carried on. The hard-sided container has to be marked as containing firearms or ammunition, and those stickers are available at the check-in counter. And individual airlines may prohibit or otherwise restrict the transportation of firearms or ammunition. I'm not aware of any airlines that prohibit it outright, but I would not be surprised to learn that there is an airline out there that charges extra fees. Amtrak only fairly recently, within the past couple of years, allowed firearms, but under fairly restrictive conditions. The reason it's fairly constrictive is that, like the TSA, they can only be carried in checked baggage, and Amtrak does not offer checked baggage on many of its routes. So you're going to need to look into that. Other restrictions are that there needs to be 24-hour notice by telephone when you're reserving. That means you can't use online check-in. And you're going to have to declare it at check-in, and it'll be stickered, just like TSA. In terms of how the firearms are actually stored, it's pretty much the same as the TSA rules. The Amtrak specific rules are on their website. They're pretty easy to get to. Greyhound or other buses, currently there's no provision for traveling with a firearm by bus. And one last note is that I've been talking about your standard handgun, shotgun, or rifle. National Firearms Act firearms, NFA firearms, sometimes called Class 3 weapons. Those are your machine guns, your silencers or suppressors, or your short-barreled rifle or shotgun, have different rules. You need to get ATF permission before those weapons cross state lines, and you can do that either by writing a letter with all the information to the ATF NFA branch, or there's a form. It's ATF form 5320.20 that you fill out, and then you need to wait to get prior approval before you can cross state lines with it. But that should only affect a very small number of gun owners. Thank you, and if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact an attorney at Merritt Webb for more information.